Hi everyone, Sarah here, your DIY home gal, and today I'm going to walk you through how I transformed this boring blank wall in my living room to this built-in electric fireplace with a subtly textured faux plaster surround as well as a recessed nook to hide the TV mount. The first thing I did was build a frame for the fireplace to sit in and for the TV to be mounted to, and this is actually only the second framing job I've ever done, so it is totally possible to do as a DIY even if you have little to no experience. Okay, so first you're going to want to use a stud finder and figure out where the studs are in your wall, and if they don't line up with where your framing is going to go, then you'll want to install backer boards and screw those boards into the studs so that you have something secure to attach your framing to. Okay, so now we can start building out the actual framing, but I do just want to mention, make sure that you go over the manual for the fireplace you're installing before creating your building plan, just because you'll usually have some specs in there. Mine specified that there didn't need to be any clearance between the fireplace and the floor, but there did need to be at least 11.8 inches between the fireplace and any mantle I might have been installing or to the ceiling, so I had to make sure that I accounted for that in my framing plan. I actually had originally wanted to install a mantle, but my ceilings are only 8 feet tall, so when I accounted for the clearance needed between the fireplace and the mantle, it basically meant I would have had to either lower the fireplace right down to the floor or push the TV up higher to the ceiling to make space for that, so in the end I just ended up scrapping the mantle. And then as far as actually building out the framing, I have seen people do this in a couple different ways, but what worked really well for me was to just build sort of like the skeleton of the sides and the front faces down on the floor, stand them up, and then secure them into place and fill in the rest from there. But you could totally build each face entirely on the floor before standing them up too. And then here you can see that I opted to secure two 2x4s together and create a header because this is where the framing that will be supporting both the TV and the mount rests. So I just wanted to make sure it could support a good amount of weight. Maybe you could argue that's a little bit overkill, but in this case, I'd rather overbuild than underbuild. Okay, now when you get to this point, stop and test out whether or not your fireplace actually fits nice and snug into your framing, because if not, you're going to want to make those adjustments now. But if it does, then give yourself a pat on the back and let's carry on. All right, so now we're going to add a couple more supports in the top section of our framing and start building out the nook where the TV mount will eventually sit. By the way, if you're having trouble getting your wood to stay where you want it to as you're trying to screw it in, just cut down a scrap piece of 2x4 and use it as a spacer like I'm doing here. You can see once I had my header screwed in, I just went ahead and removed the spacers. To finish her off, we'll add the last few supports in at the top and then measure the width and the height of the framed out TV nook so that we can cut a piece of plywood down to those dimensions. And now would be a good time to mention that you're going to want to leave one side of your framing open enough so that you have space to shimmy on back there and install your piece of plywood to the inside of the framing. I used 3/4 inch plywood just because that's what I had on hand, but you could also get away with using 1/2 inch, no problem. And I'm attaching that with a combo of a generous amount of wood glue as well as screws. And that's a wrap on our framing, but I did also install an outlet in the TV nook for the TV to plug into, which I didn't film, but you can find lots of other good tutorials on this on YouTube. But just for your reference, here's a diagram that shows where I ran that cable. Okay, now for drywall, if you've never done it before, I'm not going to lie to you, it is a little tedious, but personally, I also find it kind of rewarding because things actually start to come together and look a little bit more pretty. Here I'm using 8-foot sheets of 1/2 inch thick drywall, and I used a total of 3 sheets of drywall, 1/2 a sheet for each side installed vertically, and then another 2 sheets on the front installed horizontally. I've drywalled pretty much every room in this house, and one thing I've picked up is that if you want to make your life easier when it comes time to tape and mud, plan out your drywall install so that you have as few joints to finish as possible. And for any joints you do have, it's better to have 2 of the tapered ends of the drywall meet than 2 of the flat joints meet, because the tapered ends are much easier to finish and get them looking completely flat, especially for any new drywallers. And because I'm always going to avoid having to measure or do any math when I can, I just hung full sheets of drywall on the front and then cut them after install. Now to cut your drywall, score a line on the back of the sheet with an X-Acto knife using the edge of the framing as a guide for your blade. And then it should break in one clean line, and all you have to do is cut the paper again on the front side down that fold, and then now you can remove your piece. And then I cut out a hole in the drywall for the TV mount nook, and to do this I used a combo of a multi-tool with a cutting attachment and then also a drywall saw, because I found it was really easy to accidentally start cutting into the wood framing with the multi-tool, so I switched to the drywall saw until I was able to find the perimeter and then grabbed the multi-tool again to clean up all the edges. And then we'll just repeat that exact same process to hang the bottom sheet, and we're ready to tape and mud this thing. Now, I'm just giving you an overview of how to tape in mud here, but if this is your first time doing this and you're going into it with zero drywalling knowledge, I highly recommend checking out the channel Vancouver Carpenter. I learned everything I know about drywalling from him, so I will link one of his videos that takes you through all the details and techniques used to finish drywall below. But essentially, you'll want to apply your mud in an even layer all along your drywall joint before laying down your paper tape. And then run your taping knife back over the joint several times, applying enough pressure to remove excess mud from the joint and secure your tape, but not so much pressure to the point that you're removing too much mud and creating hollow spots under your tape, which can then cause your tape to bubble up in those spots as it dries. The good news is that we are going to be applying lots of mud all over the fireplace surround to create texture in the next part, so your joint finishing doesn't have to be as perfect as it would be if we were trying to achieve a flat look. I actually only ended up applying 2 coats of mud on all my joints and screw holes before moving on to apply the texture, whereas I normally would have applied 3 coats if I were just finishing a flat wall. By the way, if you're wondering what I'm using to apply mud to this inside corner, it's this corner roller, which I'll link below because, oh my God, it's changed my life. I used to struggle so hard to apply mud evenly on inside corners, and this thing seriously makes it a breeze. Then just fold your tape in half down the crease, apply it tight to the inside corner, and then wipe out the excess mud. Okay, and then lastly, I went ahead and installed corner beads on both the outside corners of the surround, just to make sure that those corners are durable and will hold up to any wear and tear over time. Now, the last bit of tidying up we got to do before we move on to texture is to trim out the inside of the TV mount nook. This was just some leftover 3/4 inch primed pine door jamb that I used, but just make sure that you know the width of whatever trim material you're going to be using so that you can make sure the nook is big enough that your TV mount will still fit in there after the trim is added. And then lastly, I just went around and filled all of those little gaps where the drywall met the trim with some sheetrock 90, as well as caulked all of the corners. Now for texture, I was going for a Mediterranean-inspired, organic-looking plaster texture, but I really wasn't sure exactly how to achieve that without using actual plaster, so it took a lot of trial and error. A lot. That's not an over-exaggeration. Editing it back, I was kind of laughing to myself because I counted a total of 6 times that I started applying mud and then scraped it all off again, and even after all of that, I still hated how the finish turned out after the first coat. So you can pretty much ignore this entire first coat because it really wasn't until the second coat that I got a good technique down. Here's the start of my second coat, but hopefully for you it's still your first and I've saved you the pain in the butt of all that trial and error. So here's what actually worked for me. The first thing I did was I thinned my drywall mud down to the consistency of like a thick yogurt, pretty much the same consistency as if you were going into tape and mud. And then I also applied the mud coming from all directions, but went on pretty thick with lots of overlap. You shouldn't have any gaps where you can still see drywall. And then I also left all the ridges and high spots on and didn't knock them down like you might have noticed that I did do in the first coat. When you're done, it should look something like this. Once that was all completely dry, I went back in and sanded the whole thing down using an orbital sander with 220 grit sandpaper. You're definitely going to want to hook your sander up to your shop vac for this job, otherwise I can't even think about how dusty your house will be. The goal here is, of course, not to sand it back down to the point where it's flat again, but just to kind of soften all those high spots and really give the texture that more organic and smooth feel. And then I went back in once more with a wet sponge. Now, when I say wet here, I mean really quite wet. I just had a bowl next to me that I kept dipping my sponge in. And I also applied a fair bit of pressure, especially in any spots that still looked a bit rough or where the texture was a bit too harsh. And this really helped to soften things up and create that perfect subtle texture that I wanted to achieve. Just a couple little details to finish off before we start to paint. So I circled back and filled all the nail holes in that trim around the TV mount nook with wood filler. I did 2 coats of wood filler and then sanded that down smooth after. And then I also caulked around the entire base of the fireplace surround to give it that seamless floor to ceiling look. Highly recommend taping off the floor here first though. I'm honestly not sure why I didn't, but you'll have a much easier time getting a nice clean line. Now for paint, I did 1 coat of drywall primer and then 2 coats of paint, and I will link both the primer and the paint I used below. I ended up painting my fireplace surround the exact same color as my walls, but I do also think it would look really good if you chose a contrasting color for your fireplace surround. It would kind of just make it pop a bit more and really bring out that texture. I also think a lime wash would have looked really, really good, but we're actually planning on selling this house next year, so I wanted to stick to a pretty reasonable budget. And don't forget to paint your TV mount recess. Same thing here, I just did 1 coat of primer, 2 coats of paint, exact same color as the fireplace. Okay, we're in the home stretch now, so stick with me. Your TV mount will come with a mounting template, so use it as a guide to drill your pilot holes. And then once that's done, you can grab your mount and install it with the mounting screws that it came with. It is helpful to have someone help you here just to hold it in place while you get that first screw in. And then once it's all screwed in and secured, then we can mount the TV and make any adjustments needed. Now my mount swivels, so I could level the TV after install, but some mounts only tilt up and down, in which case you'll have to make sure it's perfectly level on install. And lastly, I installed the fireplace, and I had my electrician install a dedicated circuit for the fireplace a few weeks prior. So all I had to do at this point was connect the wiring following the instructions in the manual, screw in the fireplace assembly, and slide on the glass front. And at this point, all there was left to do was take a step back and admire my work. I'm honestly so happy I pulled the trigger on this project. I feel like it's exactly what this living room needed and just adds a focal point that ties the space together. The grand total of this project came to $1,596.77, but I did buy my fireplace on sale, so it would have been about $200 more than that if it were regular price. And I am going to be adding a built-in with shelves to the right side, so stay tuned for that project. I hope this video gives you the confidence that you need to tackle this build in your own home, and if you do end up building it, please tag me. I'd love to see. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next build.